Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This is Return to World War III Dimension. Before we get into it, just want to mention Patreon. If you'd like to support the work of Astral Club and spreading information about the possibilities of astral projection, you can do so when you join Astral Club on Patreon. You get advanced episodes on Sunday, a library of downloaded episodes for your podcast app, a Patreon email where we can talk back and forth, and a brand new chat room for patrons on Patreon. So if any of that interests you, you'll find a link in the description. Next up, private lessons. If you'd like a lesson to learn how to astral project, we'd be more than glad to work with you. Or if you've done it already and just need to increase your abilities, all you have to do is just go down to the description section. There's an email there. Just request more information. This one is a little, it's a lot difficult for me. For those of you who've been around for a long time here on Astral Club, you might remember that 3 years ago, I related an experience on Astral Club, and I called the experience Nuclear War, alternate dimension. For those, I will leave a link in the description for anybody who'd like to catch up on that one. It might give you kind of an intro to what that dimension's about, so maybe you could appreciate this episode a little bit more. So if you're interested, I'll have a link in the description. But for those who don't like doing homework, real briefly, I found myself in an alternate dimension, and this goes with the Multiverse Theory. The Multiverse Theory, as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, posits that there is not just one Earth, one solar system, one universe. That when the Big Bang happened, an innumerable amount of universes operating at slightly different energy levels, operating simultaneously in the same space, but not visible based on the energy differences. It stands to reason that many of these universes, solar systems, Earths, would develop along similar lines, while some would probably head off in a very different direction based on sometimes very minor changes. In this particular instance, I found myself in a dimension that makes our current one, we should feel like we're in paradise. Because in this particular dimension, which, as I said, I visited 3 years ago, World War III had occurred starting on the 29th of September, 1983. Now, in this reality, there was also a bit of an emergency on that date. Most people at that point in time, unless you were very highly placed in intelligence, or if you were in the Soviet rocket forces, you might know that we almost had World War III. Apparently, in our dimension, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was in charge of this particular rocket force, meaning nuclear weapons. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And his job and his orders were that if the radar showed incoming missiles from the United States, that he was to launch his birds, his missiles, ASAP. I know a little bit about this subject because of my experience in the Air Force and the missile force, that minutes count, because your nuclear weapons are only of use if you launch them before they're destroyed by the enemy. Now, the Air Force at that time had a Triad, was what they called it. 3 different legs of the Triad that was defense to protect the United States using nuclear weapons. The first was airplanes. You have nuclear weapons on airplanes. They were vulnerable because when airplanes aren't in the air, they're extremely vulnerable, all lined up on a runway somewhere or in hangars. Locations very well known to the Soviets at that point in time. Number 2 was the sea-launched ballistic missiles. Now, those were a lot harder to find. They're on submarines that are cruising deep and silent, so it's kind of difficult to take those out. You can do it, but it's a lot more difficult, and trying to get 100% is probably virtually impossible. Lastly was my leg of the defense. We called it the middle leg. And that was the land-based missile defenses. And these missiles stand today in silos scattered throughout the Rocky, well, it's basically the Midwest, the Rocky kind of area. And there's a number of bases in those areas. One of them is called Minot, and is in Minot, North Dakota, and another one is in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I was stationed at Cheyenne, Wyoming. Now, in case you don't know, these missiles are buried in silos. Yes, the silos are hardened. Yes, the missiles are controlled by a team of missileers who are in a chamber which is buried deep underground and is sealed by a very thick steel blast door. And if given the proper codes, the job of these people, and the missileers, the missile launch officers, is to turn their keys within basically a second of each other, launching their birds, launching their missiles. Once that's done, their job is done because, quite frankly, the Soviet missiles would be there any time. So the chance of survivability in a nuclear war for land-based missiles is nil. Even if they weren't accurate enough, best case scenario, you somehow survived being made into a giant crater or being smashed to hell. There's a million different ways. But if they were a little bit off target, well, you might just be buried in your own little crypt, because above there's nothing but deadly radiation, which would probably kill you within 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So, and also no one's coming to get you. So it was a grim task, but a task nonetheless. At any rate, these are, I don't mean to get into a whole big thing here but it's important to understand these things. So what happened was, in this case, so the basic idea here is, in a first strike, the enemy sends a whole wave, they fire their whole arsenal off, or most of it, with the idea being that they'll be able to destroy your missiles before you get to launch them. So they get to kind of win the nuclear war. We never tested that hypothesis. And quite frankly, it's a pretty dicey hypothesis, but that's the idea. If you want to try to win a nuclear war, you really have to launch first. And you got to use all your birds. It's not the kind of thing where you just send one or two over and see what happens. Oh, no. So, on that day, the 29th of September, 1983, Stanislav Petrov saw 3 missiles coming over on his radar. Now, his job, what he had been instructed to do, was to launch his missiles, because that would be their only chance to get their licks in before they were destroyed. Because, believe me, they knew where our stuff was on land, and we knew where their stuff was too. So, there wasn't any big secrets when it comes to that kind of thing. So really, the Lieutenant Colonel Petrov had minutes to make a decision. However, instead of following his training, instead of following every military directive that he was ever given, this unknown hero, which I suggest is probably the most important man in history, whose name you don't know, decided that it was stupid, that something had to be wrong with that radar. Because why would the United States launch only 3 missiles at the Soviet Union? It wouldn't make any sense. They would have to know that the response from the Soviet Union would be overwhelming. So he did something that can be rare in the military. He thought outside the box. He disobeyed his orders and did not launch. And it turned out that this particular radar signal was faulty. There was something wrong with the unit. The United States had not launched any missiles. And World War III was narrowly avoided, at least in our reality. Now, this other reality that I traveled to, I don't know where things went wrong. I don't know if the Lieutenant Colonel Petrov was sick that day, or if he was having a bad day, or if he didn't exist at all, and there was some lieutenant or some other officer there who followed orders and ended the world. Because in that world, it was grim. And real quickly, I'll just remind people of what it was like for me there. It was a very strange dimension for me. For one thing, I couldn't fly. All I could do was run like at the speed that I typically can run. True, I didn't get tired and I didn't sweat, and neither did I feel any pain. But it was very unusual for me. That had never happened before. And my body seemed solid. Not like the usual astral body where I can fly and go through things. This thing felt solid. And indeed, I was able to be seen by a police officer or sheriff who was cruising in his beat-up old car. And if you're interested, you can check out the whole video or the whole podcast in the description. But that was the basics of what happened to me. Okay, so what happened this time? Well, I just left my body, and I've been thinking about all the different trouble spots in the world right now. I mean, of course, the war in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas, with the Houthis in the Red Sea area trying to cut off shipping, with the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier and many U.S. destroyers there, along with the English. And I hear now the Chinese are even escorting their vessels because they don't like their costs going up. And of course, thinking about China and what might happen over there. I mean, that country's going through a lot of troubles right now, a lot of upheaval, and anything could happen over there. And, there just seems to be little trouble spots popping up everywhere. And the United States isn't exactly peaceful either. We're looking at a 2024 presidential election coming up that's going to be anything but civilized. And then, of course, we've got the problems at the border right now. And there's just a lot of it's like somebody kicked over, the astral wasp nest, okay? And it just seems like they're just running around stinging everybody. So I had this in mind, and I blacked out. And when I came to, I was in my hometown where I was born and raised, not far from my boyhood home, where my parents live to this day. But this was not my reality, thankfully. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on a road which used to be pretty darn busy. It was a main road in my area of town. I felt heavy, which is odd for me. But I got up and I immediately thought of getting into the air because I always like to take a survey of things. But I couldn't fly. I was on the ground, could not fly. And I was in a body that felt an awful lot like I felt that 3 years ago when I visited that dimension that had a nuclear war. And all I could think of is, oh no, not again. And this time it's more personal. Back then, I popped up down south. Now, this is my backyard. This is where I was raised. This is where my childhood memories were formed. So let me give you a look of what I saw. The Crossroads, which were the main crossroads in my section of town, looked like a hurricane had hit it. The stoplights were lying on the ground. There was debris scattered everywhere on the road. There was weeds growing through cracks in the roads. It was obvious they hadn't been traveled in a long time. I started walking down where my old elementary school was. A bunch of the windows were busted. I started seeing the remnants of what was once an orange sign that you could tell was made out of some strong material, but the orange had been bled away. There was just little bits of it left. And it said evacuation route, and it had an arrow pointing down the main way. I imagine there was probably a lot more of those types of signs, which probably showed the way to some sort of evacuation route. But keep in mind now that it's 2024 in that world too, and that this war happened back in 1983. So a lot of decades have passed. I was shocked and depressed. The old Burger King where I used to eat sometimes at lunch when I was in school, back in the old days when you were a fourth grader, if you showed up with a note from your mom or your dad and 64 cents, you could have the crossing guard cross you across the busy road. Then you could walk on down to the Burger King and get in line right past the cigarette machine, which was right there. And then you could order your small burger, small Coke, and small fries for 64 cents. I had a lot of good memories of that. I would sit there eating my burgers while watching the other kids. I was thinking to myself, yeah, you had to eat that crappy 40-cent meal, which was the meal they served back then, or some crappy peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Yeah, back then people ate peanut butter and jelly in school. Who knew? Nobody I knew keeled over, but I guess things change. Anyway, the roof was collapsed in, and it actually said Bug King, which actually gave me a little chuckle, I guess. You know, talk about trying to find humor wherever you can find it. I went walking up a little bit further, and I saw the old Dunkin' Donuts too. And it had been its roof was still in place, but the windows were all smashed in. So somebody had obviously been in there, I don't know, looking for old donuts or something. Whatever you find in an old Dunkin' Donuts. I continued walking, and I decided, as much as I didn't want to go to my house, which was only a couple blocks away. As I walked those few blocks, there was hardly a house that wasn't damaged in some way. Windows were broken, doors were kicked in, and there was detritus everywhere. I mean, there was cars that were just parked on the side of the road. The wheels had collapsed, and they were all dusty and dirty, and some of those windows had been busted. When I made the right turn to go onto my street, and it didn't look any better, there was on my street, as I'd seen on some of the other streets, there was furniture out on the road, turned over, much of it busted up. I imagine maybe somebody was getting firewood. I don't know. Of course, the same obligatory busted in doors. I saw another one of those evacuation signs that was kind of lying crumpled up in a corner. I was able to grab it and unroll it, and that's what it was. So I was able to manipulate physically in this particular dimension for whatever reason. I'll give you my theory when I'm done. It was the same. Just imagine devastation. I mean, you've got weeds growing everywhere. You've got the woods starting to encroach. The grass was much too high. It's just, everything was dilapidated. Some roofs had caved in. For some reason, they'd made some of these roofs flat, which I never understood. Maybe it's cheaper to make a flat roof, but flat roofs aren't known for their ability to keep out water or their stability. So some of those had caved in. And then I started approaching where I could see my boyhood home, where, in this dimension, my parents live to this day. And my heart just sank. It also had a kicked-in door. The front window, which, we would look out sometimes and see who was out there, that was busted too. There were some things that were written in spray paint, X's, and that kind of stuff. I don't know what that was all about. After staring at my home for just a bit, I started walking towards it when I was tackled by a force that I just didn't see coming. That when I looked up at this monster that had grasped a hold of my arm and had yanked me down to the ground, there was this huge kind of pit bull looking thing, and it was trying to chew my arm off. Obviously, this was some sort of a dog that had gone feral. I guess it makes sense. Nobody's feeding them. And luckily, as I said before, while I could feel a sensation of pressure, no pain I didn't feel any actual pain, which, believe me, I'm glad. I actually was able to stand up with this huge animal hanging from my arm. And I was able to use my astral strength, and I whipped the dog as hard as I could, and it hit a telephone pole that had kind of teetered over halfway, but not the whole way, and it smacked it pretty hard. Now, I like dogs as much as the next guy. I had a great dog when I was a kid, but I'm none too fond of being nibbled on by them. The dog stared at me for a bit as it was recovering. I could sense that he was confused. And it kind of makes sense because, number one, I don't have a smell. So it was probably confused by that. And I didn't have a taste either, I don't imagine. And I'm sure he expected to taste some blood. He sure as heck didn't taste that. So he was kind of eyeing me up as he was recovering. When he gave a couple series of howls, and then I heard answering howls coming. It was at that time that I decided that I didn't feel like dealing with this. Yes, I couldn't be harmed, but I was more interested in doing a little more exploring, not fighting off a pack of wild animals. So I ran into my house. The entranceway, which used to hold the washer and dryer, was relatively undamaged. The basement Whereas somebody had tried to get into the glass, it was a walkout basement. They'd smashed it, but I don't think they'd actually gotten in. So the basement it looked dusty, but it wasn't too bad off. When I went upstairs, though, I could see that the living room, that the roof had collapsed in, and everything was wet, and there was moss and all kinds of fungus growing and what have you, in the remains of, my childhood home. I was able to lock the cellar door. It's still locked. And then when I went up to the living room, there was a door there that I could lock in case the dogs decided that they wanted to go hunting again. I imagine those doors would be able to hold them off for at least a period of time. But for the minute, they were quiet. Maybe they were thinking over their strategy. Maybe they were just figuring that sooner or later, the idiot has to come outside, which puts me more on their territory. So maybe that's why they were quiet. Maybe they were stalking me. At any rate, I wasn't all that worried about it, just annoyed. And I walked into the kitchen, and the kitchen had obviously suffered quite a bit. All the furniture was smashed. Much of the wood had been taken away, I assume, for some sort of fires. Of course, everything had been ransacked for food. The cupboards, the refrigerator, everything. It was just a complete mess. And I was getting kind of emotional, so I was just getting ready to walk out when I looked off in the corner, and in the corner was a piece of paper that was yellowed, that had water damage, but it was kind of on top of a little pile of wood chips and whatever, and it was kind of covered by a portion of the kitchen table. So it had been protected from, I guess, some of the worst of the elements that got in the house. So I memorized the letter, and please bear with me on this. This isn't easy to read. October 15th, 1983. Hi kids, it's Mom. I'm leaving this note on the kitchen table in case any of you make it home. Since the war began, we haven't heard from Rick. The radio listed his base as one of the Air Force bases that were hit by many missiles. All the neighbors say he's dead for sure, but I know he must be all right somehow. The National Guard is outside now with buses. They're forcing everyone onto the buses. The adults go on one set of buses while the children are being put on others. Why are they separating families? They told us not to pack anything, that everything we need will be at the resettlement camp. But they won't tell us where that is. Dad and I hope to see you all again soon. Love, Mom. I've said many times in the past that it's important to control your emotions so that you can maintain your equilibrium and maintain your astral projection, because strong emotions will pull you back to your physical body. I got pulled back to my physical body. I think you might be able to understand why that happened. I guess looking at it from a positive standpoint, our world has troubles, but we can still solve them. It's too late for that other dimension. They've already destroyed themselves. We're traveling a dangerous road right now, and we don't have a good map, and the GPS isn't working. We have to be very careful that we don't end up becoming another failed Earth, and a failed race, and a failed civilization. We still have the freedom of action. We can still make the right choices. If you benefited from that story, please hit the like button. Share it with those of like minds. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I definitely want to hear about your questions and comments. I'm very interested. And as always, this is Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.